I feel as though I should start somewhere, and this is most likely the first chapter of the history of the Jewish people. We are starting with the destruction of the first temple in Judea. It is the summer 586 BC. Jerusalem, as well as all of Judea, and all the areas next to it, such as Edom, the Philistine coastline, the Canaanite towns, they have all been taken over by Nebuchadnezzar's army. He personally was there for some of the time. This period is covered by the Bible in some detail. The Bible discusses historical figures: King Zedekiah, Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus the Great, Jeremiah the prophet, all real people with archeological backgrounds. It is thus my privilege to try and produce some order in the somewhat sporadic flow of information. Let's begin, then, with the best part. In Babylon, there was a large Jewish community. It had been established there 10 years earlier. The new exiles from Judea arrived into a position of indentured labor. They were settled in an agricultural basin and had 3 years to pay off their war debt. After that, they were expected to farm the land and pay taxes. We have a good record of their life there. Of those Jews was Ezekiel the prophet, who described life as well as established prophecies of the afterlife. The community was still governed by nobility from the house of David and priests from the house of Aaron. The prophets had to struggle their way into the consensus. Not all the Jews had been deported to Babylon. Some farmers stayed in Judea under a local Babylonian Judean governor. While the majority of Judeans were settling in Babylon, some hothead in Judea killed the governor. That sort of thing happened quite often, apparently. This assassination triggered much apprehension in Judea. Many were concerned with a Babylonian reprisal. They had been known for that sort of thing. There was a massive migration of Judeans south to Egypt. Egypt was a separate entity. A large Jewish community was settled along the Nile, all the way to the rapids of Aswan and the Sudanese border. We have some nice records of the Jewish community on Elephantine Island in the Upper Nile. 50 years after the exile to Babylon, the entire area was taken over by Persian nations that are called today the Achaemenid Empire. This is Cyrus the Great. The Persians had conquered an empire the size of Europe. They were good at running it as well. They decided to enable the Jews from Babylon to return to Judea and gave them a permit to establish a Jewish state, rebuild the temple and Jerusalem, and pay taxes as before. This permit is called the Cyrus Declaration. It set the stage for the beginning of an historical era called the Second Temple period. Starting at 530 BC, it took the Jews many years to build a population in Judea to be able to rebuild Jerusalem. It took the leadership of a priest called Ezra the scribe to get everyone in line for the community effort. Ezra had arrived in Judea 60 years after the first return had taken place. It was already the mid-5th century BC, 458 BC, more than 100 years after the destruction of the first temple. He arrived with reinforcement of people, funds, and religious authority. During his years of leadership, the Jews were finally able to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and complete the Second Temple. Ezra also formed the Council of Elders and started the painstaking effort of compiling as well as writing the Hebrew Bible. This effort lasted for about 200 years. During this period, the Judeans were having a difficult time in Judea. They had not been able to secure a devoted population. They had married into local nations and were not motivated to take on public works. During this period, the books of Zechariah, Haggai, Daniel, Judith, Esther, and such. Much of these books were written under Babylonian Persian rule, in exile. The scroll of Esther describes an unsuccessful plot in Susa, the Persian capital. It took place during the reign of Ahasuerus. The plot was led by a wazir called Haman. It was designed to depose the Jews of their property and take their lives while in the process. In Israel, Purim is celebrated to commemorate this story. All the kids get dressed up for 3 days, and there is much rejoicing. Nehemiah was another leader to partake in the effort of rebuilding Jerusalem. He arrived as governor 13 years after Ezra the scribe. Nehemiah had authority from the Persian Shah, taxing rights, and a small army at his disposal. He also brought more funds. For the years of Nehemiah we learn from the Hebrew Bible. During the lifetime of Ezra and Nehemiah, the Jewish population of Judea was strengthened. It took about 130 years to re-establish the Jewish practice in Jerusalem. It might have taken longer. At the time, Judaism was influenced by Persian religion as well. The concept of the afterlife was developed. The Messiah was becoming an established entity. Also, ritual bathing, impure and purity was introduced. More than anything else, Judaism was no longer just about sacrifice in the temple. Judea was not the main hub for Jews. Alternatives to sacrifice were introduced. We are yet unaware of dedicated praying houses, but the religion definitely became less material and more of a personal dialogue with God. A code of ethics and behavioral standards, too, were strongly implemented. One of those was the rule against intermarriage, but they were more. During this period, the rift that had opened between the Jews and the Samaritans had widened. Great mistrust and animosity had formed between the Samaritans and the Judeans. The Samaritans were the people who were occupying the state of Israel after the Assyrian exile of the 10 tribes of Israel. By the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, they had been well established, both in religion and as an ethnic group. The Jews and the Samaritans had an almost similar religion, but miles apart they were. There was no way to reconcile the two nations. This animosity lasted for the rest of history. All this time, Jews were active in Babylon, Persia, Egypt, and Judea. The Persians were occasionally fighting against Greece and defending its borders from invasions. The main religion of the Achaemenians was Zoroastrianism, and they were tolerant of other religions, plenty of which they were. It is sad for me as a history buff to not be able to explain some missing years in this account. It looks as though there are quite a few missing years. This means that the sources are not synchronized. During the Persian rule of Judea, they had mostly internal arguments, much animosity with neighboring states and nations, but a stable state of understanding with the ruling Persians. In addition to that, there was much transcribing and compilation of the Bible. Socially, we begin to hear of a formation of a new lower class called the people of the land, which on a social scale were considered less than the strict and scholastic practicing Jews. As far as the spoken language, Aramaic was used everywhere east of the coast, as well as several local languages. Hebrew was spoken less and was used mostly for religious purposes. On the coast were the Phoenicians. In the south were Arabs, and although Greece was the Persian nemesis, quite a few Hellenized folks were already living along the coast, mostly of Phoenician origin. Greece at the time was fighting internal wars. Macedonia was gaining strength and military might. At the beginning of the 4th century BC, Philip of Macedonia was able to unite Greece under his rule and started moving east. It was his son Alexander in 332 BC who humiliated the Persian Empire and took over that vast territory. Jews of Judea and Susa had sided with the Persians naturally. After the conquest, things in Judea changed. That is the subject of our next chapter.